The Soviet Union's economy was a secret for many years. It was unstoppable, but in 1991, the Soviet Union suddenly fell apart, shocking the world. This video will explain why and how the Soviet Union's economy collapsed, leaving its people in despair, and we will answer the question, is there any chance for Russia to bring back the Soviet Union again? In the 1920s, most major economies are doing very well. The 1920s were known for being rich, full of opportunities, and full of hope for the future. With the end of World War I in 1917, the world economy got a big boost, led by the United States, which had almost 50% of the world's total output at the time. From 1920 to 1929, the U.S. economy grew by a huge 42%. This was made possible by the widespread use of mass production and the spread of electricity. But the economic happiness came to a sudden stop. The stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed were huge blows to the world economy. Industrial production in the U.S. dropped by 47%, and unemployment rose to 20%, which wiped out all of the growth from the previous 10 years. Every major economy saw huge drops in output, income, and the number of people working. Except for one. The Soviet Union was the only country to survive the Great Depression and thrive. The Soviet economy boomed between 1929 and 1934, increasing industrial output by 50% while maintaining nearly zero unemployment. After such a major economic downturn, some Western economists praised the Soviet communist system, even calling it superior to Western capitalism and being the first country to launch a satellite and a person into space, and having the most weapons of mass destruction of any country in history. The Soviet Union became one of two superpowers with the largest military and second largest economy. The Soviet Union collapsed quickly, but why? How did the once envied Soviet economy collapse, leaving a bloody mark on history? To really understand the Soviet economy and where it ended up, we need to know the basic forces and conditions that led to its creation in Russia. For this, we have to go all the way back to the 1400s. After the Roman Empire fell, feudalism took over as the most common way of running a country in Europe. This means that the king owned all the land, so he could keep control and make sure everyone was safe. The king would then divide the land and give it to a group of lords. In exchange for the land, the lords gave the king the weapons he needed when he needed them. Then, the lords would use their land by making a lot of peasants pay for living and working on the land by paying high taxes and doing a lot of work for free. This system was called serfdom, and the people who lived on the land were called serfs. They were tied to the land and couldn't leave without permission from the lord. This system was made so that the vast majority of people in the lower class would be used to make money for the rich. A system like this is called an extractive economic system, and it is kept in place by an extractive political system. In this case, it was easy to understand how the government worked. A small group of lords and the king were the only ones who could change things in the country. Since the elites had a reason to keep things the same, it was hard for the peasants' situation to get better, and for a long time, it didn't. But in 1346, the bubonic plague, also called the Black Death, hit Europe for the first time. It happened in the port city of Tana, which is in the part of Russia where the Don River meets the Black Sea. The plague started in China and quickly spread all over Europe along the Silk Road. Nearly half of the people in each place it went died because of it. The feudal system was shattered when so many peasants died. When the number of people who could work suddenly dropped by a lot, the price of peasant labor and their ability to bargain both went through the roof. When there weren't enough people to work, desperate lords across Europe started trying to steal each other's peasants by saying they wouldn't need as much work or would lower taxes. This meant that people no longer had to work for free, or almost no one did. This made the peasants' lives much better, gave them more money, and gave them the power to ask for even more changes. By 1351, the English government had passed a law that said peasants could go to jail if they left the land of their current lord. This was done so that the elites could keep their power and wealth. This would have put wages and the number of people who needed to work for free back to where they were before the plague. They didn't want to lose the freedoms they had just won. This led to the English Peasant Rebellion of 1381, when the rebels took over London. In the end, the king put an end to the rebellion, and there was never another attempt to enforce the law. This happened all over Western Europe, creating a new job market where everyone could find work more easily. An economic system that benefits everyone relies on markets, not the rich. Thus, Wages cannot be lowered arbitrarily. Instead, employers pay based on value. This small increase in money made it a little easier to act and plan for the future. Over time, this got worse, and when the time was right, a large group of workers, soldiers, businessmen, and others could come together to make demands or change the system. When a coalition is large enough, no single group can seize power and become cruel like the old elite. This resulted in secure property rights, which were essential to the Industrial Revolution, which boosted national economies and living standards. This is how the economy grew in Western Europe, but what happened in Eastern Europe was very different. Unlike their counterparts in the West, peasants in the East lived in smaller villages and were less organized. Their lords, on the other hand, were in charge of larger areas of land. Because of the bubonic plague, there were not enough workers, so the Eastern lords bought up more land and added to their holdings. Also, they made it harder for the peasants to live. Since the peasants in the East were weaker, their rebellion either didn't happen at all or was a total failure. They didn't get any new freedoms. Instead, they lost even more. In the 1600s, when agricultural goods, livestock, and wheat made in the East were in high demand in the West, this problem got even worse. Since more people wanted to buy their goods, the lords decided it was in their best interest to control the peasants even more, make them do more work for free, and charge even more taxes. In terms of wealth, power, and freedom, the peasants in the West became more different from those in the East, so the kingdoms in the East stayed pretty much the same or even got more powerful. In Britain, the US, and Western Europe, the Industrial Revolution started in the middle of the 18th century. People could profit from new inventions and processes without worrying that they would be stolen because of unfair laws and lack of intellectual property rights. This led to a big increase in patents, inventions, and systems that helped the economy and industry grow. By 1900, the US, Britain, France, and Germany all had strong manufacturing industries. The Industrial Revolution was hard on Eastern monarchies and extractive systems like the Russian Empire. Russia covered 1/7 of the planet in 1850, but its economy was small and its people poor. This was justified. Russia was still based on the feudal system of the 14th century, so the king, known as Tsar, had near total control over his population, and the small nobility class exploited the poor by running the old traditional industries. Industrialization's creative destruction frightened the king and elites. Creative destruction occurs when new inventions or systems replace old industries with more efficient and productive ones, taking wealth and resources from the elite class and building a stronger middle class that can challenge the current system. To maintain control, the Tsar stopped industrialization, stifling economic growth in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. Thus, the Russian Empire was a backward, impoverished nation with little freedom. In 1861, serfdom was abolished, but the new system maintained many of the same oppressions and did not improve quality of life. By 1914, Russian society, outraged from centuries of oppression under a tyrannical monarchy, had repeatedly revolted, unsuccessfully, to gain Western freedoms. With an incompetent Tsar, Nicholas II, and a humiliating loss to the Japanese in 1905, the system was unstable and revolution was imminent. Germany declared war on Russia on August 1, 1914, to defend Austria-Hungary after its invasion of Serbia. By 1917, Russia was losing badly to the Germans, its people were starving, its economy had collapsed, and Tsar Nicholas had made some terrible political decisions like appointing himself military commander while leaving his German wife in charge of the country. Protests broke out in St. Petersburg, soldiers mutinied, and Tsar Nicholas II, who had ruled for over 300 years, abdicated under pressure. The less radical provisional government and the more organized and radical communist Bolsheviks quickly divided the country, but a bloody 3-year civil war ensued. By the end, Russia was in ruins, and the communists led by Lenin had taken control and kept it. Soon after, the Soviet Union was formed. The German philosopher Karl Marx was a big influence on communist ideas. He thought that the constant fight between capitalism and the workers would lead to a revolution in which the working class would take over the means of production and build a society without classes or private property where everyone worked for the common good. The original goal of the Russian Revolution, which was originally built on these ideas, was to get rid of the cruel Tsarist government and replace it with a more fair socialist government. But when the Bolsheviks took power and they were a small group of highly racist and well-organized Marxists, they didn't have anything built in to stop tyranny, unlike in the West. First, the Bolsheviks made a new political elite just like the one they had just gotten rid of. They kicked people out of the party who didn't agree with them, and they used force to build their socialist utopia. During the Civil War in 1918, the first communist economy was set up. All businesses and economic processes were taken over by the government. Due to the collapse of the economy, the Bolsheviks' Red Army did not have enough weapons or food to win the war. Rural peasants lost food and grain, and all industry went to military production. War communism had reduced agricultural output and peasant public opinion. By 1921, the new economic policy was launched to stabilize food supply, privatized agriculture and small businesses from 1921 to 1928, rebuilding after total collapse boosted the economy. In 1924, Stalin became Communist Party leader after Lenin died of a stroke. In 1928, the first five-year plan was launched in 1928, which nationalized production again. By this point, the Soviet government controlled every input and output for every factory, farm, enterprise, store, and price. Stalin and the innermost party officials in the Politburo would decide the economy's general direction. Then a series of government agencies would create a complex and detailed plan. The five-year plan was passed after minor negotiations with farm and factory managers. Stalin's first major initiative was to rapidly expand heavy industry, including steel and military manufacturing, to catch up economically to other European powers. This rapid industrialization plan involved heavily taxing agriculture and sending massive amounts of food, labor, and supplies to city factories. In 1928, 85% of the Soviet population was rural peasants, whose outdated methods made farming unproductive. These scattered village communes' taxation was inefficient. Stalin's solution was to force peasant farmers onto state-run or communal farms where hundreds or thousands worked for the state. Collectivization killed 12 million people. Most food was shipped to cities to help industrialize heavy industries. Taxation and food redistribution became easier, but farmers' output had no impact on their pay, which exacerbated inefficiencies. The first major issue with the Soviet economic system was the agricultural sector, which plagued it throughout its history. In capitalist societies, allow you to work anywhere. Working smarter, harder, or longer benefits your employer. They'll give you more money or benefits to keep you from leaving, so you'll work harder. Since wages were fixed in the Communist Soviet Union, there was little incentive to do more work. The government's later incentives wouldn't help workers, so to keep the population happy, they decided to make the prices lower and fixed. Thus, output and prices were unrelated, unlike in capitalist societies. This meant that demand for goods at set prices exceeded production. Items were rarely in stock and sold out quickly. This, along with the fact that heavy industry was consistently emphasized over consumer goods manufacturing. The economy kept going. The Soviet Union's economy grew by 5.8% per year from 1928 to 1940, almost doubling while Western economies stagnated. This was done by forcing people from less productive industries into more productive ones. The massive peasant population working in inefficient village farms was moved to productive heavy industry and construction, boosting economic activity. By dramatically increasing inputs, even unproductive workers could boost output. To make more steel, build more steel factories, and give each more iron and workers, the Soviet economy grew quickly but poorly. Industry heads and enterprise managers negotiated how much input was needed for the planned output in the final step of a five-year plan. Since enterprise managers only cared about reaching the planned output, they always asked for as many inputs as possible. The Soviet planners demanded more output this year with the same inputs to boost productivity. They incentivized managers by paying them based on meeting the target output and giving bonuses for exceeding it. However, smart managers usually produced outputs above or below the target. While managers would receive a bonus for producing more, they were concerned about next year's pay. By exceeding the target this year, planners would set that output as the target for next year, making it harder to get next year's pay. If the target was achievable, managers would stop producing when they reached it, but if it was unattainable, there was no reason to work for nothing. So they produced as little as they could get away with, hoping next year targets would be lowered. Supply chains were notoriously erratic. This meant there were often too many workers with little to do. When supplies arrived, extra labor was needed to meet quotas. Since jobs were legally guaranteed in the Soviet economy, enterprise managers wanted as many workers as possible. The average Soviet factory had twice as many workers as a comparable US factory. While zero unemployment was better than any capitalist society then or now, it was due to law and inefficiencies rather than a more productive system. New equipment that would boost factory productivity often went unused, which hurt productivity. Again, the enterprise manager had no incentive to boost productivity, since retraining workers and integrating the new equipment into the manufacturing line would take time. He would lose money and risk not meeting his output goals that year. Productivity gains were slow and stunted. Limited information caused most incentive issues. The Soviet planners did not have complete and accurate information to plan an industrialized nation's economy. Planners could not use incentives to boost efficiency, so inefficient industries persisted. Lack of innovation was the Soviet economy's final and most significant failure. Since property rights were established and maintained, there was a huge incentive to invent or improve a manufacturing process in the capitalist world because you could patent it and make a lot of money. In the Soviet Union, innovation was discouraged by fixed wages, a limited selection of goods, and the fear of retribution. Without organic innovation, the Soviet Union bought advanced machinery to use and copy to drive growth. When the Soviets hired Fiat to build a high-tech car factory, they bought an entire factory. However, this was expensive and the Soviet Union disliked relying on the West, especially for innovation. With an inefficient farming sector that necessitated mass food importation, costs soared. Fortunately, the Soviet Union had abundant natural resources, particularly oil. When oil prices rose in the 1970s, they could offset importation costs by exporting oil. As oil reserves in Western Russia dried up and oil prices returned to normal, importation costs rose again and the economy stagnated. The Soviet Union could no longer dramatically increase inputs because most of the population had moved from low-productivity industries to high-productivity industries, which were the main source of economic growth. Growth had slowed to 2%, lower than the developed West. Only massive military spending yielded significant gains, and this wasn't enough. The growth that made people happy with having few freedoms started to slow down, and the Soviet Union's political system, which was way too big for its own good, put it on an unstoppable path to economic stagnation and, eventually, collapse. But the seeds of the Soviet economy's downfall were already there before the country was even made. Unlike the revolutions in Western Europe and the United States, which gradually led to more rights and freedoms, the Bolsheviks who took power did not represent a large group of people, so they became dictators. But in the end, the Soviet economic system was a cautionary tale about the dangers of dictatorial governments that only care about themselves. Early on, the Soviet Union grew quickly, but it wasn't enough to improve the lives of its people. Instead, it was to protect those in power. And for answering the question, is it possible for Russia to bring back the Soviet Union again? In a quick answer, no, Russia won't be able to bring the Soviet Union back again. The end of the Cold War was marked by the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. This was a decision that could not be changed. Since then, the world has changed a lot, and what was once a two-sided world is now a world with many different sides. So, it's not likely that the Soviet Union will come back to life again. Please share your thoughts and comments below.